The FBI cannot find any evidence that I was born. On my FBI wanted poster, they list my birth date as July 16th, 1974, and in parentheses, not substantiated by birth records. Anyway, I was born. I am the older of two children. My sister Beverly was born 5 years later. The name my mama gave me was Joanne Deborah Byron. I am told that I was fat, that I was a fat, happy baby, and that I was talking in complete sentences when I was about 9 months old. They say that I was lazy, though, that I talked way before I learned to walk. Everybody says I had my days mixed up with my nights and kept everybody up all night. I'm still pretty much a night owl. The only other tale I remember hearing about my babyhood was that I would scream at the top of my lungs whenever anybody wearing furs or feathers came near me. I'm still not too fond of furs and feathers. My mother and father were divorced shortly after I was born. I lived with my mother, my aunt, now Evelyn Williams, my grandmother Lulu Hill, and my grandfather Frank Hill in a house in the Bricktown section of Jamaica, New York. The only thing I remember about that house is the backyard, which I loved, and the huge dog next door. I remember the dog well because he terrified me. To my young eyes, he looked like a giant, a canine version of King Kong or Mighty Joe Young. I'm still not too wild about dogs. When I was 3 years old, my grandparents sold the house and moved down south. I moved with them. We moved into a big wooden house on 7th Street in Wilmington, North Carolina. It was the house my grandfather had grown up in. It had a wraparound porch with a big green swing and, of course, rosebuds in the front of the yard and a pecan tree in the back. My grandfather originally thought that the house had belonged to my great grandfather, Papa Link, short for Lincoln, but they found out he had only been given the use of the house for his lifetime. Papa Link had worked as a chauffeur for one of the most prominent white families in Wilmington, and the story goes, had been a prominent member of the black community. He had my great grandmother, Mama Jessie. He and my great grandmother, Mama Jessie, had worked hard all their lives, had raised 11 children in that house, and had died under the impression that the house was theirs. Fine print and white lawyers have a way of robbing black people of what is theirs. My grandparents were forced to buy the house again. To buy the house again. Who's better than you? Nobody. Who? Nobody. Get that head up. Yes. Yes, who? Yes, grandmommy. I want that head held up high, and I don't want you taking no mess from anybody. You understand? Yes, grandmommy. Don't you let me hear about anybody walking over my grandbaby. No, grandmommy. I don't want nobody taking advantage of you. You hear me? Yes, I hear you. Yes, who? Yes, grandmommy. All of my family tried to instill in me a sense of personal dignity, but my grandmother and grandfather were really fanatic about it. Over and over, they would tell me, "You're as good as anyone else. Don't let anybody tell you that they're better than you." My grandparents strictly forbade me to say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, or to look down at my shoes, or to make subservient gestures when talking to white people. You look them in the eye when you talk to them, I was told, and speak up like you've got some sense. I was told to speak in a loud, clear voice and to hold my head up high, or risk having my grandparents knock it off my shoulders. My grandparents were big on respect. I was to be polite and respectful to adults, to say good morning or good evening as I passed the neighbors' houses. Any kind of backtalk or sass was simply out of question. My grandparents didn't even permit me to answer questions with a simple yes or no. Instead, I had to say yes, grandmother, or no, grandfather. But when it came to dealing with white people in the segregated South, my grandmother would tell me menacingly, "Don't you respect nobody that don't respect you. You hear me?" Yes, grandmother. I would answer, my voice almost in a whisper. "Speak up," she would tell me repeatedly, something she seemed hell-bent on making me do. She would send me to the store with clear instruction on what to bring back. I was under no circumstances to come home with inferior goods, something which happened all too often to black people in the South. You tell them that you don't want any garbage and you better not come back with any. She would warn me. If the owner sold me something that my grandmother didn't like, I would have to return to the store and get the thing changed or get my money back. You speak up loud and clear. Don't let me have to go down to that store. Scared to death of the fuss of my grandmother I would make if she had to go to the store herself, I would hurry back to the store prepared to raise almighty hell. Whenever my grandmother heard about somebody being mistreated, especially if it was a man mistreating a woman, she would glare at me and say, "Don't you let anybody mistreat you, you hear? We're not raising you up to be mistreated, you hear? I don't want you taking no mess off of nobody, you understand?" "Yes, grandmother," I would answer, for what seemed like the millionth time, wondering why my grandmother liked to repeat herself so often. The tactics that my grandparents used were crude, and I heard it when they would repeat everything so often. But the lessons they taught me, more than anything else I learned in my life, helped me to deal with the things I would face growing up in America. But a lot of times, for my grandparents, pride and dignity were hooked up on things like position of money. For them, being just as good as white people meant having what white people had. They would tell me to go to school and study so that I could have a nice house and nice clothes and a nice car. White people don't want to see us with nothing. They would tell me that's why you've got to get your education so that you can be somebody and have something in life. Becoming somebody in life just didn't mean too much to me. I wanted to feel happy, to feel good. My awareness of class differences in the black community came at an early age. Although my grandmother taught me more about being proud and strong than anyone else I know, she had a lot of Booker T. Washington pull yourself up by the bootstraps, talented 10th ideas. She had worked hard and had made a decent living as a piece worker in a factory, but she had other ideas for me. She was determined that I would become part of the Wilmington's talented 10th, the privileged class, part of the so-called black bourgeoisie. One of her first steps was to sternly forbid me to play with alley rats. It was impossible for me to obey her orders since I had absolutely no idea what an alley rat was. I often became the unwitting object of my grandmother's fury, charged with the crime of alley rat playing. My grandmother, writhing with annoyance, would threaten me with untold punishments if I continued my evil ways. I received strict orders to abandon my penchant for alley rats and play with decent children. But we would never agree on who decent children were. Decent children to my grandmother were a whole nother story. Decent children came from decent families. How did you know what a decent family was? A decent family lived in a decent house. How did you know what a decent house was? A decent house was fixed up nice and had a sidewalk in front of it. A decent families didn't let their kids play in the street with no shoes and didn't let their kids say ain't. Little did my grandmother know that ain't was my favorite word once I got 2 feet out of her hearing range. My grandmother had a little alley rat right under her roof and she didn't even know it. Alley rats supposedly lived in alleys and rundown shacks, but my grandmother would often call one of my friends an alley rat even if the kid didn't live in an alley. Dutifully, to put some sense in my head, she would take me to visit decent children. These decent little souls were invariably the offspring of Wilmington's black doctors, lawyers, preachers, and undertakers, school teachers, barbershop owners, and the editor of the colored newspaper were also decent. In most of these decent little play sessions, the other kids and I would stand around looking at each other awkwardly. Sometimes we would get it on and have some fun, but more often than not, it would be glare at each other time or show and tell time, the kids showing me their toys and such while the grown ups oohed and awed. The worst times were eaten at the preacher's house, where they would take an hour saying grace or playing ball with the undertaker's daughter. She always wanted me to play ball, and I was scared to death that the ball was going to roll into the part where they kept the dead people and end up in the mouth of some corpse. My grandmother, would have caught a shit fit if she had known that one of her favorite little decent kids' favorite game was playing show and tell with his ding-a-ling and threatening to pee on everybody. After these visits, my grandmother would chirp for a week about how nice my little decent friends were and how nicely we played together, while I would groan silently and keep the expression on my face one shade away from insolent. My grandmother and I waged a standoff battle damn near until I was grown. It wasn't that I wanted to defy her. It was that I just liked who I liked. I didn't care what kind of house my friends had or whether or not they lived in alleys. All that mattered was whether I liked them. I was convinced then and am still convinced that in some things kids have a lot more sense than adults. But to my young mind, life in Wilmington was exciting. There were always new places to go and new cousins, aunts, and uncles to meet. One of my favorite relatives was Aunt Lou. She says she was Mama's Jessie's sister, and she lived across town. She was my grandfather's only remaining relative in Wilmington, the rest having moved up north or out west. Aunt Lou had a magic house full of all kinds of favorite flavors, textures, smells, and things. There were whole worlds in her house to explore. She would always feed me something good to eat and then let me run wild. I didn't know until I was grown that Aunt Lou had a son. His name was Uncle Willie, and he died before I was born. Uncle Willie was something of a legend around Wilmington during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Whenever he came to town, they say Aunt Lou would plead and moan and worry until he was in safer territory up north. They say that he would tear down the colored and white only signs and break the Jim Crow laws at whim. He would go around demanding his rights and denouncing the oppression of black people. And it is logical that no one who loved him felt the least bit comfortable until he was gone. They would call him Wild Willie or that crazy Indian. He was supposedly black and Cherokee, but people called him that because of his nature. They say he had a lot of friends and that he died of natural causes. The rest of my relatives I met, the rest of the relatives I met came from my grandmother's side. My grandmother's family lived in Seabreeze outside of Wilmington, close to Carolina Beach. Their last name was Freeman, and they were famous for being high-strung, quick-tempered, and emotional. They seldom worked for anybody, choosing instead to live on the land their father had left them. They worked as farmers and fishermen and would own small stores, and they owned small stores. I have also heard that they were in the bootleg business. My grandmother's father was a Cherokee Indian. He died when my grandmother was very young. Nobody knows too much about him except that somehow he acquired a great deal of land and left it to his children. The land was very valuable because much of it bordered either on the river or on the ocean. Everybody had a different theory about what my great grandfather had done to acquire it, but it was because of this land that my grandparents had moved down south. In 1950, the year we moved to Wilmington, the South was completely segregated. Black people were forbidden to go to many places, and that included the beach. Sometimes they would travel all the way to South Carolina just to see the ocean. My grandparents decided to open a business on their land. It consisted of a restaurant, lockers where people could change their clothes, and an area for dancing and hanging out. The popular name for the beach was Bob City, although my grandparents insisted on calling it Freeman's Beach. Throughout my childhood, the name Freeman had no particular significance. It was just a name like any other name. It wasn't until I was grown and began to read Black history that I discovered the significance of the name. After slavery, many black people refused to use the last names of their masters. They called themselves freemen instead. Their name was also used by Africans who were free before slavery was officially abolished. But it was mainly after the abolition of chattel slavery that many black people changed their names to freemen. After learning this, I saw my ancestors in a new light. For me, the beach was a wonderful place, and to this day is no place, there is no place on this earth that I love more. I have never seen a beach more beautiful than it was then. Before they decided to build a canal right through the property of my grandparents, it is not, now just a pale shadow of what it used to be, most of it destroyed by erosion. But back then there were majestic sand dunes covered with tall seagrass where my cousins and I would build forts, houses, and sometimes cities. When time permitted, we spent hours hiding and making sneak attacks on one another. The sand was fine and clean, and in the beginning of summer we could find just about every imaginable kind of seashell. When the sun got hot, we would sit in the old blue Jeep my grandfather drove and play with frilly things like paper dolls and teacups. After I learned to read, I would sit in the sun under the huge hats my grandmother always made me wear and read one book after another. Every other week, my grandfather went to the colored library on Red Cross Street, and the librarian would send 10 or so books for me to read. As soon as I finished reading them, my grandfather would go and get another batch. My imagination was vivid, with fragments of pirates and the bombs, Bombsy twins floating around. I would sit looking out of the ocean and thinking about everything. I imagined all places I had read about on the other side of the ocean and wondered if I would ever see them. And of course, I daydreamed about all kinds of stuff, mostly of it silly. But my days were not spent simply daydreaming. My grandparents were firm believers in work. They had worked all their lives, and there was no way they were going to tolerate any lazy, good for nothing around them. Every day there were chores to do, and was no playing until they were accomplished. I did things like putting the potato chips on the racks, putting sodas in the cooler, wiping the tables clean, etc. When customers were there, I would sell small stuff like potato chips, nabs, pickles, and pickled pig feet. I would also set the tables and bring customers things they needed. But my main job was collecting 50 cents for parking because there was no road to our beach. The paved road ended with the white section. My grandparents had to pay for the dirt road and parking lot to be laid over the sand. Truckloads of dirt were brought and a steamroller mashed it down so that it was hard enough to drive on. This was an expensive process, so my grandparents decided to charge 50 cents for parking. I would count and make change at a very early age, so it was my job to collect the 50 cents. During the week it wasn't too time consuming, but on the weekends, if the weather was nice, it was an all-day job. Cars and buses, people came from all over North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. There were church groups, school groups, social clubs, women's clubs, Boy Scouts, and Girl Scouts. All kinds of people would come to the beach, some with a little money and some that you could tell were real poor. In the years I spent on that beach, only one or two people hassled me. Most of them treated me very kindly, just like I was their kid. The people who came to the beach fascinated me. I loved to see them come and go. After a while, I would recognize the regulars, and it didn't take me long to learn their names. Some of them gave me tips, which I usually spent on the piccolo jukebox. There were lots of lovers, and I spent some of my time spying on them in the parking lot, but they weren't too interesting. All they did was squirm a lot. Checking license plates, I could recognize almost all of the state's license plates on sight, and collecting bugs, I had a huge collection, were much more interesting. But watching families was better. On their picnics with their fried chicken, potato salads, and watermelons. Some of them looked so happy you could tell they didn't get a chance to go to many picnics. and I was always on the watch for kids to play with when I wasn't busy. Then there were the good timers. Their cars smelled like whiskey. They would dance a lot, eat a lot, spend a lot on the piccolo, and many times I would wonder if they had made it home all right. A lot of poor people came to the beach. Sometimes the floors of their raggedy old cars or trucks were half rotted out. Usually a lot of little children were with them, and they wouldn't have bathing suits. They went swimming in whatever clothes they had worn to the beach, and half the time the little kids wore nothing. Then there were those who came to put on airs, usually in the evening, all dressed up to eat dinner. Many would say, I can't stand the sun. I'm too black already. I ain't going out in no sun. It was amazing the number of people who said they were too black already. We looked at them like they were crazy because we loved the sun. But the umbrellas for rent were like hotcakes. Some people draped clothes and blankets around the umbrella so that no light penetrated whatsoever. One lady always put a paper bag on her head and poked holes through it for her eyes. Some of the women refused to go near the water because they were afraid their hair would go bad. One of the moving things for me was when someone saw the ocean for the first time. It was amazing to watch. They would stand there in awe, overpowered and overwhelmed, as if they had come face to face with God or with the vastness of the universe. I remember one time a preacher brought an old lady to the beach. She was the oldest looking person I had ever seen. She said that she just wanted to see the ocean before she died. She stood there in one spot for so long she looked like she was in a trance. Then, with the help of the preacher, she hobbled around, picked up the mundane shells, and put them in her handkerchief as if they were the most precious things in the world. I love to eat, still do, and the beach was right up my alley. Right now, when I think about the fried chicken and fish dinners, my mouth starts to water. But what really sends me off is remembering those seafood platters with fish, shrimp, oysters, deviled crab, fried clam fritters, and french fries with lettuce and tomato on the side. If my memory is any good, I think they sold for about $4.50. Next to food, music was my love. Fats Domino, Nat King Cole, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, The Platters, Brooke Benton, Bobby Blue Bland, James Brown, Dina Washington, Maxine Brown, Big Mabel were some of the people I listened to during those beach years. I loved to dance. They would play music, and I would dance my natural heart out. That was another way I would collect tips. People would egg me on. Go on, gal. Go, boy. Look at that little girl dance. But I love to see people dance too. Many a time my grandmother or grandfather had to call me out of the trance I was in watching somebody dance instead of doing my chores. At night, my cousin, who sometimes came over to work on the beach, told ghost stories. They loved to tell them to me because I would get scared out of my wits. They would tell me about who came back from the dead, about snakes that could crawl 100 miles an hour and beat you to death with their tails, and about red phantoms and haints and all kinds of other horrible things. My imagination was vivid, and before the night was over, the seagrass turned to monsters and the wind made ghost howls. Sometimes even my grandmother and grandfather would get into the ghost story sessions. My grandfather's favorite one goes like this. He was driving home in a terrible storm one night. It was lightning and thunder like crazy. He saw lightning hit a tree ahead of him and saw the tree fall across the road. He tried to stop, but it was too late. He braced himself to hit the tree, but nothing happened. The car went smoothly through it as if it weren't there. He turned around, and sure enough, the tree was still lying across the road. He swears that the story is true, and I'm convinced that he thoroughly believes it is. We were, however, visited by real live ghosts. They were the phantoms of the parking lot. It seemed that the white citizens of Wilmington and Carolina Beach were not at all happy with my grandparents had dared to build on the land and to start a colored business. They were too close we were too close for their comfort. So they would visit us from time to time to express their disapproval. I don't know for a fact that they were card-carrying members of the Klan, but judging from their behavior, I think they were. But then, of course, they weren't wearing their sheets. They could have just been red-blooded American boys out for some good, clean fun. The parking lot was made of dirt, and cars spinning around in it at breakneck speed would ruin it in no time. 2 or 3 of them would ride around the parking lot spinning and skidding while they shouted curses and racist insults. One time they fired a gun in the air. I remember seeing them and hearing them out there and wondering what they were going to do next. More than once I saw my grandfather go to where he kept his guns and carry it quietly to where he had been sitting. Somehow this made me more afraid because I knew that he too thought they were scary. Finally, my grandfather put a big fat chain, almost as big as the kind used to anchor ships, across the road at the entrance to the parking lot. This soon eliminated our nightly visitors. One night, as my grandmother and I were fastening the chain in place and locking it, a white man drove up to the lot and in an arrogant tone of voice ordered my grandmother to open the gate so that he could turn his car around. My grandmother, looking very dignified, said, "No, I can't let you do that." Then, in a nicer voice, he asked my grandmother again to open the gate. "No," she said again. "Come on now, auntie. I got a mammy in my house. Now open the gate and let me turn around." "What'd you say?" asked my grandmother. "I said I got a mammy in my house. Now come on, open up." My grandmother leaned over in the man's face. "I don't care how many mammies you got in your house. I don't care if you've got 100 mammies in your house. You're going to back out of here tonight, and I want you off of my property right now, right now." The man turned as red as a redneck can turn and started to back his car up. The road was very narrow, barely wide enough for one car, and there was no way in hell he could turn around without getting stuck in the sand. He backed up for more than a quarter of a mile. As we looked at him backing up, my grandmother and I laughed so hard the tears fell from our eyes. Every day when we drove from the house on 7th Street to the beach, we passed a beautiful park with a zoo. Every day I would beg, plead, whine, and nag my grandmother to take me to the zoo. It was almost an obsession. She would always say that one day she would take me, but one day never came. I would sit in the car, pouting, thinking how mean she was. I thought that she had to be the meanest woman on the face of the earth. Finally, with the strangest look on her face, she told me that we were not allowed in the zoo because we were black. When we were on the beach, we shopped at Carolina Beach. It had an amusement park, but of course black people were not permitted to go in. Every time we passed it, I looked at the merry-go-round and the Ferris wheel and the little cars and airplanes, and my heart would just long to ride them. But my favorite forbidden ride had little boats in a pool of water. Every time I passed them, I felt frustrated and deprived. Of course, persistent creature that I am, I always asked to be taken on the rides, knowing full well that the answer would be what the answer would be. One summer, my mother and sister and I walking down the boardwalk were walking down the boardwalk. My mother was spending part of her summer helping my grandparents in the business. As soon as we neared the rise, I went into my usual act. I continued ad nauseum until my mother, grinning, said, "All right now, I'm going to try to get us in. When we get over there, I don't want to hear one word out of you either. Just let me do the talking. And if they ask you anything, don't answer, okay? Okay?" My mother went over to the ticket booth and began talking. I didn't understand a word she was saying. The lady at the ticket window kept telling my mother that she couldn't sell her any tickets. My mother kept talking very fast and waving her hands. The manager came over and told my mother she couldn't buy any tickets and that we couldn't go into the park. My mother kept talking and waving her hands, and soon she was screaming this foreign language. I didn't know if she was speaking a play language or a real one. Several other men came over. They talked to my mother. She continued. After the men went to one side and had a conference, they returned and told the ticket seller to give my mother the tickets. I couldn't believe it. All at once we were laughing and giggling and riding the rides. All the white people were staring at us, but we didn't care. We were busy having a ball. When I got into one of those little boats, my mother practically had to drag me out. I was in my glory. When we finished the rides, we went to the Dairy Queen for ice cream. We sang and laughed all the way home. When we got home, my mother explained that she had been speaking Spanish and had told the managers that she was from a Spanish country and that if he didn't let us in, she would call the embassy of the United Nations and I don't know who all else. We laughed and talked about it for days, but it was a lesson I never forgot. Anybody, no matter who they were, could come right off the boat and get more rights and respect than American-born blacks. My first school experience was Miss Perkins School in Wilmington. It was a little two-room school on Red Cross Street where I learned the fundamentals of reading, writing, and arithmetic. I was 4 years old. Miss Perkins School was the closest thing to nursery school that black people in Wilmington had. But she didn't play the baby play stuff. We were there to learn. I was prone to colds, however, and I guess that pot-bellied stove in the school didn't give off enough heat. I was out sick more than I was in.